Hi everyone. Welcome to Lecture 9 on the American and the French Revolutions. We'll begin with an overview of what was going on in the English colonies of North America by the 18th century. The Americans, despite their relative autonomy, were still intimately tied to the English nation. Developments in England, such as the Glorious Revolution, new scientific methods, the rise of parliamentary government, made their way across the Atlantic to the colonies in a number of ways: personal letters, newspapers, other printed materials. Further, the background of Enlightenment thought and its discussion of natural rights, Enlightenment ideals of liberty trickled across the Atlantic, giving Americans much to think about. So how do we get to a revolution based upon ideas such as liberty and freedom? Well, for the first 50 years or so of English settlement in North America, England pretty much left their colonists alone to govern their own affairs. As a result, each individual colony created its own representative legislature. Each individual colony passed laws and taxed its citizens as it saw fit. And this idea of self-government was very much valued by the English colonists here in North America. With this setup in place over the years, relations between Britain and its colonies were generally friendly, and the colonies relied very heavily on English trade for its economic success. However, the relationship between Britain and its North American colonies starts to turn sour by the time we get to the 17th century with the restoration of the monarchy in England after the Civil War. If you'll recall, after the English Civil War, we have two new monarchs, Charles II and James II, and they were deeply alarmed at the autonomy of their colonies in North America. They preferred to run a tighter ship and exert more direct control over these colonies. This was an unwelcome change from the standpoint of colonists in North America. Britain will start to enforce, for example, its mercantilist policy, which meant that Britain wanted to strictly control all trade, both to the colonies and away from the colonies. Well, the colonists are not excited by this. They would rather sell their products to whoever pays them the highest price, and in some cases that was not the home country of Britain. We'll also see questions that start to pop up over access to Western lands. The British colonies began along the eastern seaboard, as you can see here in the map, and what we're going to see is over time, British colonists began moving westward to try to find cheap, available farmland. Unfortunately, moving west means running directly into so-called New France, France's colonial holdings in North America. This will be one among several reasons why we will see a war develop between England and France that becomes known as the 7 Years' War. It's also referred to as the French and Indian War. Now, while England ultimately prevailed over their foe, the French, in this conflict, at the end of it, they were still faced with a difficult task. The British had borrowed heavily from British and Dutch bankers to finance this war, and as a consequence, the national debt in Britain almost doubled. And for the government of England, they believed that their North American colonists should have to cough up some money to help pay for this conflict, since they triggered this war, at least in part. This will mean higher taxes being placed upon British citizens both at home in Britain and also in North America. This is going to kick up some resentment here in the colonies. Additionally, another point of tension that will arise between Britain and its North American colonies will be the ongoing presence of British troops in North America, even years after the end of the 7 Years' War. Some colonists objected to the presence of soldiers on street corners, cussing, drinking, and fighting with locals. There's the belief that the British soldiers are looking down upon the colonists, and the colonists are just simply suspicious of why the soldiers are still here in such large numbers. Well, by the late 18th century, all these factors combined to persuade many English leaders that the colonies probably needed a major reorganization and that the central authority should be in London. In other words, they began making moves to try to remind the colonists who really was boss. The British Parliament began passing a series of laws designed to raise revenue from the colonies. The Sugar Act and then ultimately the Stamp Act, which was vigorously protested by the colonists. From the standpoint of the colonists, they not only don't want to have to pay higher taxes, but taxes were a decision that should only be made by American assemblies. The American colonists were used to governing themselves largely for a long period of time, and the battle cry, "No taxation without representation," will start to appear on the lips of many colonists. They protested that they had no representatives actually in Parliament back in London, and so therefore they could not be taxed. Tensions boiled over in Boston on March 5, 1770, in what becomes known as the Boston Massacre. Pushing and shoving and name-calling between a group of British soldiers and Boston colonists ultimately turned tragic when the soldiers opened fire on the crowd. The colonists were incensed and demanded that Britain began recognizing their rights. Meanwhile, Britain kind of viewed the colonists like spoiled brats. Parliament looked at the complaints that the colonists were lodging against the home country and thought that they were acting like ungrateful children. They had birthed the colonies. They had nurtured and protected them over the years. They had sent a fighting force to defend them during the 7 Years' War. But to the colonists, they're tired of being treated like children in their estimation. So this is not going to be a disagreement that's going to be settled quickly, and unfortunately it won't be settled peacefully either. The British Parliament will continue to pass restrictive legislation on the colonies, trying to bring them into line. And for their part, the colonists will continue to resist. And for the colonists, they're going to be very much interested in the Enlightenment ideals of John Locke, who we discussed in a prior lecture. In the words of John Locke, citizens who felt like that their rights were being infringed upon by their own government had a right to rebellion. And so from the standpoint of the colonists, this is really resonating with them at this stage. In addition to independent acts of sabotage on the part of the colonists towards British soldiers, towards customs agents, along with open fighting that will break out between both sides in April of 1775 at the first battles of the Revolution at Concord and Lexington, we're going to see that things are turning sour very, very quickly. The Americans began to meet among themselves. The First Continental Congress will be held then in May of 1775. The Second Continental Congress will meet yet again in an effort to come to terms with the British, but it was becoming apparent that war was on the horizon. The most famous and crucial act of the Second Continental Congress, this meeting of colonial representatives, was the Declaration of Independence, issued on July 4th, 1776. Reluctantly, they have come to realize that they simply cannot make peace with Parliament and King George. The net result? This declaration stated that all bonds and all relationships between America and Great Britain were now severed. Well, after several years' worth of combat, much of it lopsided in favor of England, we will see that the sturdy colonists will manage to outlast the British. They won't defeat them resoundingly, but instead they will manage to wear out Britain in this case. The British public by 1782 was growing very weary of ongoing warfare and the taxes that went along with that. And what we will see is the following year in 1783, the Treaty of Paris will be signed, bringing an end to the American Revolution. Both sides offered concessions. The Americans agreed to still pay off their pre-war debts to Britain and to stop persecuting loyalists to the crown. Britain agreed to vacate forts along the western frontier, and the independence of the former colonies was officially recognized. The events of the American Revolution did not go unnoticed around the world. Especially in France, there was a keen interest in this uprising. France, remember, where Enlightenment thought had been vigorously discussed by philosophers of the age, such as Voltaire and Rousseau. Moreover, you have a number of French soldiers returning home from North America after helping out the Americans in their bid for independence. In fact, the American Revolution could not have been won without French aid. And when these soldiers return, they're carrying with them many of the prevailing ideas of the American Revolution, notions of democracy, liberty, equality. It's a rude shock, therefore, when they get back to France and find that they enjoy very little of those freedoms in their homeland. Instead, they're returning to a society almost frozen in time, one in which people have virtually no voice in their own government or any hope for freedom of speech and liberty. And a lot of this is tied to the legacy of one of their previous kings, Louis XIV. If you'll think back several lectures, we discussed Louis XIV and his bid for absolute power, his statement, quote, "L'état c'est moi," I am the state. He had alienated many people with his heavy-handed rule, with his religious intolerance, with his practices of censorship and repression. And then, of course, his ongoing wars had virtually bankrupted France. Well, now moving forward in time to the 1780s, we have one of his heirs, Louis XVI, who is on the throne in France, and he is not highly regarded either. Louis XVI was very out of touch with the needs of his people. He seemed very callous and uncaring. And he also wanted to be an absolutist ruler like his father and grandfather before him. He was very clear in his statement, quote, "I have no intention of sharing my authority," unquote. In addition to that, ongoing financial difficulties were plaguing the French state under his reign. The French were still paying off the debts that they'd incurred helping the Americans fight in their revolution, and they were still paying off debt from before that, from fighting the British in the 7 Years' War. To give you an idea of how dire this situation was, almost half of France's budget by the 1780s was going just to pay off their war debt, with only about 20% or so of their budget going to actually running the country, maintaining infrastructure, helping out the poor, etc. There was just increasingly less and less money to help the state function. It didn't help either that the royal family alone took about 6% of the country's budget just to support its lavish lifestyle, the expensive travel of Louis XVI, his fancy clothing, his elaborate parties. Adding insult to injury, taxes were being raised. While the rich were living, gaudy lives of luxury, the poor were finding an ever-increasing amount of their meager income having to go to finance the state. This deficit, the budget has a major shortfall year after year in France, has to be addressed. One of the key issues, though, in this very stratified society is that there were several classes that enjoyed tax-free status. They could not have new taxes imposed upon them. And those groups were the clergy, the representatives of the Roman Catholic Church were untaxed, and the nobility. So this is a situation where two of the wealthiest classes in French society, you can't tax them because of ties of tradition. The net result of this is that the already poor and the growing middle class, known as the bourgeoisie, are the ones getting stuck paying much more. And wouldn't you know it, higher taxes began taking effect right at a time when there were a series of bad crops in France. In 1789, the wheat crops failed. Well, that wheat was typically turned into bread, which was the staple of peasants and poor people's diet during this period. People are quite literally beginning to starve to death. You have massive outbreaks of famine, not just through the French countryside, but in urban cities like Paris. And remember, the budget is very tight here, so the king is not able to come up with much immediate cash to try to throw at this problem, to try to purchase wheat to give to the poor. So resentment is quickly building. Anger is beginning to boil over by the summer of 1789 among the poor, who feel like they've just been kind of hung out to dry. No one is taking care of them. And we'll pick up with this story in the second half of lecture number 9.